Welcome to the Impact of Women on Election 2020, what will be an informative conversation between accomplished UCLA experts. Our panel brings experience and research knowledge on the influence women bring to the election cycle. Our discussion is brought to you by UCLA Women in Philanthropy, a group that celebrates and inspires women's giving across the UCLA campus. And we foster women's participation on campus boards and volunteer leadership positions. I'm Susan Rice, president of UCLA Women in Philanthropy. It is a pleasure to have you with us today. Our group celebrated its 25th anniversary in 2019. Women in Philanthropy now boasts over 2,800 members who contribute time, talent, and treasure to every corner of the university. Besides serving on multiple advisory groups on campus, including the UCLA Foundation, we showcase areas and topics across campus to engage the UCLA community. During this unusual time, we have expanded our outreach to members and other supporters of UCLA to bring some intellectual and emotional nourishment to you while you're at home. Today's presentation will address the influence women will have in the upcoming election, both in the voting booth and as candidates running for office. What does this mean for elections nationally and locally? What does the field look like? To what degree will the participation of women as candidates and voters have? And what can and should women do to have their voices heard? Let me tell you a little bit about our panel of experts to help answer these questions. Dr. Laurie Frazier is an associate professor of political science and African American studies at UCLA. She serves as department vice chair for graduate studies in political science. And currently, she is also the acting director of the Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies at UCLA. Her research and teaching examines racial, ethnic, African American politics, women in politics, immigrant political incorporation, and state and local politics. Her current research is supported by the National Science Foundation, including the Collaborative Multiracial Post-Election Survey, CMPS, a national multiracial, ethnic, multilingual post-election study of socio-political behavior and public policy preferences in the United States. Wendy Gruel brings on-the-ground experience as the former Los Angeles City Controller, the past pro temp of the Los Angeles City Council, and as a candidate for mayor in 2013. A UCLA grad, she started her career in public service, working for her mentor, former Mayor Tom Bradley, also a UCLA alum. Among many other public service roles, Wendy serves on the Luskin School of Public Affairs Board and chaired the highly successful conference, the Luskin Summit 2020. Our third panelist is Natalie Ucla, Associate Professor of Political Science and Asian American Studies. Her research interests include racial, ethnic politics, immigration, political behavior, public opinion. She is the author of 2 books. We also have Lynn Maverick, the Marvin Hoffenberger Professor of American Politics and Public Policy at UCLA. She is a contributing columnist to The Upshot at the New York Times and a recipient of the Andrew F. Carnegie Prize in the Humanities and Social Sciences. Professor Maverick's research has been supported by the National Science Foundation. She has served on the advisory boards of both the British and American National Election Studies. At UCLA, she teaches courses on campaigns, elections, public opinion, and the 1960s. And leading our panel as moderator is Gary Segura, Dean of the Luskin School of Public Affairs at UCLA since 2017. Prior to coming to UCLA, Dean Segura served as the Morris M. Doyle Centennial Professor of Public Policy and Professor of Political Science, and Professor and former Chair of Chicana Studies at Stanford University. His research focuses on issues of political representation and social cleavages, the domestic politics of wartime public opinion, and the politics of America's growing Latino minority. Before we head into what I know will be a lively discussion about the impact women will have on the upcoming election, let me mention that we have allowed time for the panelists to answer questions from the audience. Please submit your question through the Q&A function on the bottom of your Zoom screen. The questions will be reviewed and consolidated by staff, and Dean Segura will present them to our panelists for their response. Dean Segura.
Thank you, Susan. And first of all, a big thank you to Women in Philanthropy for staging this forum. And I am so honored to be able to sort of stage a discussion between these four distinguished and really insightful women who are going to share with us their view of the election. And I've received many of your questions in advance. And so I think we'll be able to get to every topic, if not every particular question, and I'll do my best to structure that. I'm going to throw all four of my participants a curveball, and that is, I'm going to start by asking you a very simple question to which there is a one word followed by a one sentence answer, no more, because it will get this elephant out of the room right away. Who will win the November election? And in one sentence, a week after it happens, what will the pundits say was the reason for the outcome? And I'll start with Wendy.
I get so lucky to be the first one. You all get to think about it now. You did not tell us about it. So thank you so much, and to Women in Philanthropy and UCLA for allowing me to participate, and for you, Gary, and Susan and others. I will, part of my, because I am a Democrat, I will say Biden, Kamala Harris. I think it will be closer. This is a little longer than one sentence, but it will be closer than anyone thinks. I think there's a lot in 40 days that is going to happen. I think the comment afterwards will be who the pundits will be talking about who came to vote. And that is both reflective of who was excited about this particular election, but also how it relates to mail-in voting or actually going into a voting booth, and how that is impacted by COVID. That was a little longer than one sentence, but.
That's fine. I'll let you slide on the first one. Natalie Masuoka, Professor.
Hi, everyone, thank you for the invitation. I think my answer will also be Biden. And actually, this is the most appropriate panel because I think the answer really is going to be women voters. Women are the modal voter, and who they choose to support in this election is really going to be the point that tips the balance of the scale in November.
That's great. Professor Maverick.
Thanks for having all of us. I guess, not to add variety to this, I'm going to say that if I had to bet today, I would say Biden is the winner of the election. And I think 1 week after the election, and this actually might be right, the pundits will be saying that the election was a performance evaluation on the incumbent president's handling of the COVID crisis and the subsequent economic fallout. And voters decided that he was fired.
That's a very apprentice kind of moment there. Good on you. Laurie Frazier.
Hi, everyone, and thank you again to Women in Philanthropy. Biden Harris, definitely, I'm thinking. And mobilization, mobilization, mobilization. How well did it go, particularly among women of color voters with Harris on the ticket? What impact did it have for mobilization?
Okay, that's a great way to start. Now we've got that out of the way. I'm sure we'll come back to it later. Of the role that women are going to play in the 2020 election, and what life is like for women running for public office in 2020 at both the vice presidential nominee of the Democratic Party, but also women up and down the ticket from both political parties. So let's start with a very fair, kind of common question we get a lot, which is, what is the nature and origin of the gender gap? Is the gender gap something that's real, or is it something that people are talking about on television? And I'm going to turn, and is it consistent across groups? So I'm going to ask that question first to Lynn Maverick. Lynn, is there a gender gap?
Yes, I think the gender gap is real. A lot of what you hear on cable television might not be real, but this one is. And it has been increasing over time, over a long, if you take a sort of the long view, a long arc, couple decades. And I think that to answer your question about like what is driving that, there are issues on which women hold the same opinion as men, but they care a lot more about them. And so if they could choose a candidate who would prioritize things like universal gun background check, 12 weeks maternity leave, pathway for dreamers, transgender service in the military, women care about those issues more and want them to be at the top of candidates' priority lists relative to men. So there's something about the kind of world that women want to live in that actually looks a little different than the kind of world they want the same thing. For example, consistent within party, but women would like to see these things at the top of the list.
Laurie, would you say that Lynn's answer applies equally across groups of women, or are women to be thought of as sort of a homogenous voting bloc, or how would we complicate that answer?
I think that public policy matters, and so I agree with Lynn in that regard, but the partisan gender gap between male and female voters is driven by historical patterns of women of color voters, particularly Black women who are the stalwarts of the Democratic Party, particularly since the 1960s. Black women have voted in the majority for the Democratic Party and its candidates, and driving that partisan gender gap. In fact, white women, we know, partisanship really matters. Only a few times, 64, 96, where we see white women voting consistently, with the exception of those 2 years, for the Republican Party candidate in presidential elections. Now, there's great variation when we get down ballot with regards to how white women cast their ballot, but for presidential elections, we know that partisanship matters. And white women on the whole, not when you're disaggregating or looking at different social demographics among white women. But if you look at white women as a whole, they largely vote Republican, right? And we've seen a little bit of that shift in 2018, right? But even during the Obama campaigns of 08 and 2012, white women voted in the majority for the Republican Party. And only a few times in our nation's history did it shift. Will we expect to see a shift in 2020? Well, this is the one to watch. White women are the one to watch here, particularly now that we're looking a little bit closer at white women who are college educated versus not, and other kinds of demographics among white women. And so we are enthusiastic, I know, in the world of those who look at the intersections of race and gender, to sort of look at how this plays out, particularly for different geographies, like women in the suburbs, in cities and rural areas. And the last thing I'll say there is women are not a monolith. Like Lynn noted, their public policy preferences and practices do matter in terms of influencing turnout and who they vote for, but also partisanship does matter, and it is a strong predictor of choosing a candidate.
Great. Let me continue down this line of thought. So, you know, Lynn has talked about the policy issues that divide women and men, and Laurie has correctly pointed out that African American women are the most reliable Democratic constituency in the United States. And I want to turn to Natalie Masuoka. So, how do we think about Asian American, Indigenous, or Latino women in the context of white women who've historically been Republican, but maybe more evenly divided than in some other years, versus African American women who are like lockstep Democrats? What do we think about these other groups?
Yeah, you know, what's really interesting about the gender gap is, you know, it is in many ways, it's in its own way a universal phenomenon. But we see the gender gap really the most narrow amongst African Americans, because as Laurie said, African Americans are really powerfully all Democratic voters, almost overwhelmingly. And we see a much wider gender gap split amongst white Americans. And interestingly, for Asian Americans and Latinos, I think I haven't seen as much data on Indigenous populations. I think that this is definitely somewhere where, you know, our research really could expand. But the gender gap is actually, we found is much more narrow, but in between Blacks and whites over time for Latinos and Asian Americans. Actually, some of the data on Asian Americans would suggest that there's a very minimal gender gap, when in some ways it's sometimes it's reversed depending on what surveys you're looking at for men versus women for Asian America. So, you know, it's an interesting thing about how gender interacts with race, because we see that really the gender gap differences are really quite distinctive. You know, if we look across these different groups, you know, whites versus Blacks, and then as we think about Asians, Latinos, and hopefully we'll have more research on some of our other populations.
That's great. I'm going to turn to Wendy now with a question having to do with women running for office. So there's the gender gap in terms of voting, but there's also a gender gap in terms of candidates, right? So we have sort of two odd issues or odd observations for this year. The first is that there's an unusually large number of Republican women running for office, and that's been noted by a number of pundits. And at the same time, I think we're if not at a historic low, because obviously once the Congress was all male, but the Republican conference in the House of Representatives is among the most male it has been in the last 25, 30 years. And so I'd like to hear your perspective about running for office. I believe you're a Democrat, so I assume that you understand that perspective, but do you have any insights on your experience versus a Republican woman seeking office?
So I think, and just to add on what others have said, you know, since 1964, more women have voted in presidential races than men. And if you also look historically, it's not only race, ethnicity, but it is also based on their educational, you know, so college graduates voting a little bit differently in different areas in the white population, white women, et cetera. And you're right that this is the lowest number of women in the Republican elected office in the House and Senate than have been in the past. It is when you look at the number, overall there's 101 women in the House of Representatives, and the other number for the Senate, there's 26. So 26 senators, 17 Democrats, 9 Republicans, and in the House, 88 Democrats and 13 Republicans in the women. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. One, the Democratic Party has focused in on creating organizations that support women. So you can go online and see, and I'm on the board of Emily's List and Emerge, and trying to help train women and get them prepared and support them to be elected. Although there are a few on the Republican side, not as much. And you hear a lot within the Republican Party that they need to do a better job of recruiting women to run. And that is an important part of it. And it goes to when, you know, I ran for office, we had 5 women on the city council when I got elected to the Los Angeles City Council. It's nonpartisan. And I won with both Republican and Democratic voters. Today, we have only 2 women on the city council, and for 4 years, we only had 1. There's only been 2 women who have won citywide in the city of Los Angeles in its history. And lastly, there's only been 1 woman. I was lucky enough to be in the runoff for mayor of Los Angeles, but that has only happened once in our history. I think running for office for women is very unique and different. We are judged differently. So whether it is how you act, so are you tough enough? If you're too tough, how does that is impacted? We also, everything from how our hair looks, are we married or not married? Do we have children? And how do we present ourselves? To challenging even, we have to always educate people about how we can win the election. I spent half my time telling people how I was going to win, because they don't always believe the women can raise the money and do what it takes and be tough enough to do that. And so I think women have to be very thick-skinned to step into the world. Even today is, I think, greater focus and attention on your personal life and impact. And then I know we're going to ask some other questions, but one thing I want to make clear is that we talked about, I think it was you, Lynn, about public policy and why women are passionate. And so it's to vote for women, it's very personal. So at times in which healthcare is really important, like now during COVID, to when it is about childcare. When you think of the people who are impacted by COVID, those that don't have affordable childcare or have an ability to provide for their family, that's very personal. And so I think you get more women voting when it is impacting their lives on a daily basis.
Thank you. I'm going to turn back to Lynn. I think Wendy's lead-in was really helpful because, Wendy, there's a lot of issues, healthcare being one of them, that are going to be unusually salient in this election. I want to probe Lynn a little bit on what we used to refer to as dog whistle politics, but in the current environment, I guess we would call it bullhorn politics, which is the president's none too subtle appeal to suburban women. So suburban women have been told, really in explicit terms, that if they vote for Biden, then marauding hordes of angry protesters are going to come tear apart their homes, burn their churches to the ground. And I think the biggest threat in the conversation was that Black people might actually move into their neighborhood. I mean, that's how explicit it was. I know you're gathering a mountain of data on people of all walks of life in all parts of the country. Is Trump's suburban, I feel like I'm in a Leave It to Beaver episode, but is Trump's suburban appeal real? Like, is he actually trying this, and with what effect?
Yeah, the Leave It to Beaver reference is a really great one. And when I look at these data, so we have collected a lot of data with my colleague Chris Chisanovich in political science. We've been interviewing about 6,000 people a week, every week since July of 2019. So we've almost amassed 400,000 interviews, which means I have about 50,000 suburban women that I can really dig into and sort of figure out how different are they. And I got very interested in this at exactly the moment you're talking about, when Trump just boldly went out there and started talking about housing. And I thought, like, oh, this can't possibly, well, first, this can't really be what the presidential campaign is going to be about, but how is that really, he's usually like, he's listening to talk radio and he's got like some sort of niche that he's figured out he's working his way into. And I thought, is that real? So I went and I started looking, and there are a lot of people to compare suburban women to. So you can think about, are they different than, suburban white women? Are they different than urban white women? Are they different than suburban white men? Those are the two groups that I thought were the most interesting comparators. And so we've been asking people their favorability ratings of Democrats, of Republicans, of Trump, of Biden. And then in sort of like an astonishing stroke of luck, we put the police on the survey way back in July of 2019 as a group that we wanted to get favorability ratings on. So I looked at that too. And a couple of interesting patterns emerge, and I don't want to bury the lead. So the takeaway here is that this Trump strategy is not crazy. There's something to this. And when I look at all these things, these are there are four focal moments. There's the killing of George Floyd. There's the protests that come after, the Democratic National Convention and the Republican National Convention. And suburban women, everybody thinks less of the police after Memorial Day weekend. So the ratings of the police just plummet in a way that you usually don't see public opinion move. Everybody's ratings have come back up, but not to their pre-Memorial Day level, but they've come up the most for suburban white women. Okay, so keep that little idea in mind. Then during the protests, ratings of Democrats are going down for suburban white women, and their ratings of Republicans are going up. Okay, their ratings of Trump are going up during the protests after the killing of George Floyd. Then you get to the DNC and their ratings of Biden go down. They don't like what they're seeing. And here's where urban white women are different. Their ratings of Biden are going to go up then. But then the RNC happens and the suburban women, their ratings of Donald Trump go up even more. So they're increasing their ratings of Trump during the protest movements. And then during the DNC, they say, oh, we don't like Biden very much. And during the RNC, they say, we like Trump more. And so I think that McCloskey family moment with them sitting on the couch, talking directly to suburban families about exactly what you said, Gary, that had an effect on suburban white women. And so they do look different than urban white women and than suburban men in some cases.
Laurie, we passed the Fair Housing Act in 1968, and it was among the most wildly ineffective pieces of civil rights legislation, in part because it was designed to fail. And George Lipsitz has written about this very passionately. Are you surprised that issues of residential segregation are still in the political discourse in 2020? First, and secondly, building off of Lynn's observation that some white suburban women responded to this, law and order construction. How do you think women of color respond to the construction? What's happening to the other observers of these moments?
Thank you. I'm not surprised at all that the appeals would continue to suburban white women, and Lynn's findings are consistent with what we know about suburban white women in terms of their public policy orientations, in terms of their views towards police and policing, law and order, those kinds of other things. And these findings are consistent over time. When we began to look at the realities though, so I must say, while her findings are consistent with what we know, I think the strategy of Trump to target these ideas towards the suburbs is problematic, because since the year 2000, over 60% of the US population resided in the suburbs. And that means more than half of Asians and Latinos, including Asian and Latino women, and particularly in the largest metropolitan areas. Blacks have been the majority. Black suburbanization, it crossed the 50% mark back in 2008. The majority of immigrants live in the suburbs of large metropolitan areas. So the suburbs are incredibly diverse. So picking out white women, targeting white women and appealing to them, I think is not going to pay the kinds of dividends that it might have paid before 1992 when Bill Clinton, for example, he appealed to the soccer mom, and George Bush into the security mom. All of these are different ways of appealing in many ways to white women. The soccer mom, the suburban mom, the security mom. These appeals are nothing different. But nowadays, right, the majority of the US population resides in the suburbs, and for Asians, Latinos, and Blacks, the majority of those groups are no longer residing in urban areas alone, right? But they're residing in the suburbs as well. And so any data that we collect, right, on suburban women, it has to be disaggregated at the intersections of race and gender and ethnicity in order to tell a full story about what's going on, so we can better understand the nuances and whether or not that political strategy will pay any dividends.
That's a good caveat. We are a suburbanized population. Increasingly, I wonder what the term suburban has come to mean. And I'm going to direct this question to Natalie. So Laurie's observation that there are folks like Lynn, like in Lynn's data, in the suburbs, but there are also other kinds of folks in the suburbs. Do you think the president's aware of that? Or does he actually believe that the suburbs remain predominantly white? So that's the first question. And secondly, can we extend beyond that and start to think about what are the dynamics at work here with respect to an issue agenda? So, Lynn started by pointing out that even these suburban white women are going to care about things like healthcare or whatever. Are there other issues which would blunt any sort of effect of the racial dog whistle / bullhorn that we've been seeing?
I'm gonna have to think about your second question there, Gary. The taking on the first question, because I think that's this is a really important conversation for us to intervene in. There's in political science, we have this idea of what we call the difference between implicit and explicit cues. The explicit being that, we kind of talk bluntly about whites and blacks, we use real blunt tropes, right, assigned to racial minorities. There's also the use of what we call implicit cues, which are these kind of, in many ways, indirect references to trying to refer to blacks or other racial minorities without actually even having to say, right, that they're referencing those groups. And so one of the types of, you could see as an implicit reference is this use of urban, where historically we've really seen many politicians use urban to denote communities of color, right, based on this historic idea, right, that communities of color are in the urban core, right, and then white suburban is kind of the leave it to beaver, as you and Lynn have raised that kind of conception of where each racial group lives, and so in that way, Trump is really relying, right, on these long-standing stereotypes and then employing an implicit cue. And so I think the question is, in today's world, is this implicit cue even working? Right, so the need to try to make an indirect reference to whites versus communities of color, is that really working? Are we really seeing through the strategy, right, of trying to talk about race, but really not talking about it so that you can't get any fingers pointed, right, about these kind of dog whistle politics. And so I think that this is the kind of problematic point that Laurie is also trying to raise, which is that, when we're trying to do this urban versus suburban, in the electorate, are we really in our daily lives really seeing that really come to play, or is it really just a trope that we saw from that kind of leave it to beaver kind of television era, which was trying to portray specific racial populations in specific areas? But in terms of a policy, I mean, I think that the idea of what different movements like Black Lives Matter, right, various different Me Too, right, that there are various different counter arguments to trying to raise awareness, right, of fighting against these stereotypic tropes, these prototypical tropes, raising awareness of different issues, of different inequalities, of different ways that people experience the world that go beyond, right, the prototypical assumptions, I think are hopefully going to be effective ways of trying to counter these in many ways, these implicit messages I think that Trump is trying to use.
Thank you. Before I move on, I do want the audience to know that I am monitoring the questions as they come in and taking notes in order to pose downstream questions. So please know that I am reading the questions that you're posing to the Q&A structure. I'm going to turn to Wendy now. I'm going to leave the suburbs for a moment. Wendy, you were one time a candidate to be the mayor of maybe the quintessential coastal elite city. And in distinguishing between the suburbs and the cities, you know, we are on a 20-year trajectory, I think, to try to construct cities. Well, actually, probably two-generation effort, but really recently in 20 years, to construct cities is somehow or another inherently un-American or alien. I'm reminded of Sarah Palin's comment about real Americans. And some of us thought there was a racial element to that, but there was very clearly a big city versus suburb and small town notion. So can you carry the flag for Los Angeles a little bit? Tell us what the issue agenda should be for urban America. And increasingly, by the way, the world's population and the United States' population is increasingly urban in the broader sense of the term. So what say the coastal elites?
Well, I think, and it builds upon that, you know, when they talk about suburban and you look at Los Angeles, I mean, people from other parts of the country and the world, when you talk about how large the city of Los Angeles is with 4 million people, and how the suburbs of the San Fernando Valley, which used to be primarily white, is now not majority white. And so suburbs for Los Angeles and for coastal, and even when you look at other places, are not homogeneous anymore. And so I think it is doesn't affect us as much when they'll talk about, Trump will talk about suburban women, because it's very, very different. I think when the issues that are facing urban and suburban areas here in Los Angeles are not necessarily unique to some of the other parts of the country. It is about jobs and it's about education, and that continues to be a challenge. And so whether you are in the Midwest or you are here, making sure that your kid has access to quality education, and particularly during COVID, it's still all in that lens relative to where we are today. And I think as well, homelessness, which continues to be a very high number here in Los Angeles and in some of the major cities, also reflects the challenges on housing. And it goes into what Trump was trying to say, which was, we know there's homelessness in housing, but we're not going to put those people in your neighborhood, in your community. And so it was, as mentioned, a way in which to say we're separating those people, whether those are dreamers or others that you would put in that category necessarily as well. And I think it is important as you look at the post convention, as Lynn mentioned, some of the studies and looking at that, and the post protests, you saw Biden and Kamala Harris very distinctly say protesters versus looters. And they really continue to push that, because they saw those numbers. They saw even though people were upset with the police and all that, they saw we're going to lose people because they may not like Trump on these things, but they want to have the protection. And they're all of a sudden thinking it's going to occur in my neighborhood that there's going to be looters and women. And then just the last thing I want to mention, which I know we all care about, is the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. and how that has brought women's issues to the forefront again in this election, and that people are thinking about that. And that's why 40 days can make a big difference as to what's occurring, because abortion is still a big issue. And you will see, for those that thought it was those that are pro-choice, that you were protected going forward, they see this as a challenge to that. So they're going to be motivated to go vote, as well as the evangelical or others who are pro-life is going to keep them. So Trump is always trying to keep his base. He knows he's not going to really go around that base. He's going to keep that base, and then he wants to make sure that the rest of the people don't get to vote as much. And so you'll see focus on the base, and how to reduce the number of women or minorities, et cetera, and urban areas not to go vote. And that's why there's a big fight, obviously, around absentee voting and so forth. And we know historically, I know when I ran for office my first time, and even at mayor, and you get your absentee votes in California are the first that show up. And everyone really wanted to get the absentees, but they were more Republican. So you always wanted to make sure that you got those Republican votes early on in a nonpartisan race here in Los Angeles. And now it's kind of, it's switching, but there's a very different electorate that comes on the day of, and those that are absentee. Sorry, I went long, I apologize.
No, that's great. I'm going to stay with you for a second, because I want to come back to this question of voter suppression, but for the moment, let's stay on this issue agenda, and particularly the presence and role of Senator Harris on the ticket. So if you have any insights into what Senator Harris is experiencing right now, why don't you share? But also tell me how you think Harris affects the issue agenda of the election, if at all.
I mean, Senator Harris, not only being the first vice presidential woman candidate from on the Democratic side, but being a woman of color, is I think a benefit. There's a question of whether that's pro or con necessarily. I think she is unique because she also was the state attorney general. And so she also has that kind of law and order side to her. And what she has always tried to say is that she is, although someone who has been on social justice and civil rights, she has used that in any position that she's had to ensure that if you are going to be as she called, the top cop of the state, you're going to do it in a way that is understanding and reminiscent of social justice. And so for her, we've had an opportunity over the years to talk about the difference between men and women running for office, the difference between raising money and how hard it is for women, harder it is for women to raise money than it is men. We've sat in rooms together and made phone calls asking people, and we laugh about it and also it's about women who give. Women give less than men at a certain level. You can study, some of the professors here may be able to say where they've looked at, a man and a woman who may make the same amount or be partners in a firm, and the men will give more. The women will give less. Again, some reasons they may be being paid less than their counterparts because there's not equal pay, but it is also about some of the other things they feel responsible for, and they're just looking at do I need to spend this money here, or am I going to use it on my children or other things that are necessary? So I think Kamala is experiencing all of that at a level none of us could ever experience, as did Hillary Clinton. But I think for Kamala, it is an added attention because of race.
Lynn, looking at your voluminous data set, what effect has Senator Harris had on women, but certainly the entire electorate, but particularly on women voters? Do you have a sense of that?
We were, I mean, the answer is not too much yet. Maybe, this has been a really slow campaign, like in the sense of the pace of what's happening. And that's largely due to COVID. Maybe that's going to pick up when the debates start next week and when the vice presidential debate happens, and she takes more center stage. But right now, an interesting thing, we've seen this year, but also in past years, we ask these favorability ratings I mentioned before, and sometimes people who run in the primaries end up being on the presidential ticket. And what would you think would be a better predictor of their favorability rating, in sort of October of an election year? Their own favorability from February, when they were the same person they are in February and October, or the favorability rating of the person whose ticket they've joined. So like Joe Biden's favorability rating was more correlated with Barack Obama's favorability rating when he was named as VP than it was with Joe Biden's own favorability rating. So Kamala Harris sort of gets a little bit sort of swamped by the top of the ticket. And that's just sort of, I think, how people process them as a pair. But it's not unique to her. It has happened in the past too.
I'm going to stick with the theme of gender, and I'm going to turn to you, Laurie. One of the questioners raised a really important comment, which was that this notion that there are women's issues is really an antiquated notion. It proceeds from a very gendered assumption about the structure of life and the structure of responsibility. So on the one hand, let's take that as a given. On the other hand, we have good evidence to suggest that female voters are more likely to care about some of these issues that we've traditionally called women's issues, if for no other reason than the failure to perform as parents on the part of their male partners means that some of these child rearing issues fall to women disproportionately, no matter what the deal is between the husband and wife. So can you talk a little bit about that? And then let me throw in one more thing. The unfairness that Wendy talks about with respect to how women candidates are treated has most recently extended to Kamala Harris's dating life when she was single, which in the context of the Me Too experience of the last 5 years, and an opponent with 22 live accusations of sexual harassment and assault, how do we make of the role of gender, women's issues, the issue of gender specifically in this environment, and what Senator Harris might be able to say to that?
Well, Gary, racist and sexist stereotypes are alive and well in the campaign. And women of color are all too familiar with these kinds of sexist and racist tropes. And so I just reflect on the moment I found out that Kamala was selected. And I was a little shocked that the Biden campaign actually chose Harris, not because she wasn't a strong candidate, but I wasn't sure about courage in this time, about stepping out and doing something completely new, right? Versus going with a safe bet. I just wasn't sure. And that is just, my cautiousness, right? But in that moment, I remember being very prideful as a Black woman, like, wow, this is amazing, right? Very, very proud. And then a moment later, trepidation and fear. In the same way of calling my father when Obama was selected as the nominee, the first thing my father, who was born in 1927 in Little Rock, Arkansas, well, Tilla, where he says Little Rock, but it's really Tilla, Arkansas, right outside, a small town outside of Tilla. And he said, I was like, Dad, aren't you excited about this? This is gonna be the first Black male president. And he said, no, I'm concerned about Michelle and the kids. And he went on and on about that fear and trepidation. And for Kamala, I remember that pride was quelled by that fear and trepidation of the ways in which women of color are attacked with racist and sexist tropes. The Willie Brown being the most recent one from the Trump administration, and bringing up all of these kinds of tropes that you know, doesn't allow a wide group of women, because women are not a monolith. And this circles back to your original question. Women are not a monolith, right? While we share some values and ideas about things that matter to us, like aid to the poor or education or other kinds of things, but even when you break down the data and you look among race and gender and ethnicity, other kinds of identities like sexuality, that women are not a monolith. And to treat us as so, right, really does a disservice both for when we do step out there, right, and began to have the courage to run for office, right? The expectations of us are so much greater, right? One quick thing I'll add with this is that I've been doing a lot of, you know, both listening and talking to women of color, particularly Black women, who are on the ground doing this kind of work. And I would say that I don't want to leave this conversation without also giving some ideas about the different kinds of organizations that have been so helpful to Wendy and other kinds of women and women of color. For example, Higher Heights and other kinds of community groups and local groups who and national groups who have really helped to pave the way. And I hope that I'm able to offer some of those to our group that can be distributed afterwards, but many of which are nonpartisan, many of which care about encouraging women to run in general. And so oftentimes the way we start as political scientists, when we want to study women in politics and elected office, we look at something called political ambition. And we want to know what factors influence political ambition among women and whether it differs between men and women or among women. And so for the kind of work that I'm doing now and some of my more recent findings, there is such strong support for Black women. Our political ambition is tied to the role of civic engagement. So for those Black women who step out there and want to run for office, even though they know the challenges that they're going to face, that if you have been ingrained in civic engagement and civic practices, that you're influenced and inspired to have a higher propensity for wanting to run for office. So if you want to look at the younger generation, Gary, and figure out what can help propel them, even though they know they're going to face racist and sexist stereotypes, problems with raising money, other kinds of things, you know, get them civically engaged, get them inspired and motivated to want to make change, because my findings suggest that it has an impact on one's political ambition, particularly for women of color.
That's great. And in a minute, we're going to do a little bit of a lightning round in a minute. I'm going to ask about building that bench of candidates, because I think it's certainly a concern for the GOP, but I think it's really a concern for the Democrats as well. Natalie, I want to come back to the Me Too, Time's Up. It's hard to think of a social movement that got more attention and more resonance with the population until the George Floyd murder than the Me Too experience over the last 3 or 4 years. And you know, the revelations about Harvey Weinstein and the Jeffrey Epstein ugliness and all of the connections that implicated and so forth. I haven't heard much about it in the campaign, and why do you think that is? Is it there was in fact an accusation against the vice president, but there are obviously many accusations against the president. What's your take on the role of Me Too, Time's Up in the current political environment?
Yeah, you know, I mean, this is really an area that is very complex, and what some of the research that I've conducted is also very highly partisan. So in a study that I did with my co-author Jane Junn, who's a faculty member at USC, you know, we looked at, you know, how to what extent voters penalize candidates, specifically male candidates, in accusations of sexual harassment. And what we found is that, one, the issue is most likely to move Democrats overall, both male and women Democrats. they do penalize candidates for accusations of sexual harassment. But specifically, the biggest change in attitudes was really amongst Democratic women. Democratic women are highly critical, and in particular, they're highly critical of members of their own party when they see a member of their own party being accused of sexual harassment. So, this is in many ways, a real dangerous area for the Democratic Party because this is an area that probably, I'm sure as well, the campaign strategists know, move Democratic women in very clear and swift ways away from their candidates. And so in some ways, I think that, if parties are trying to mobilize their candidates, it's less of an issue for Republicans. So Republicans, therefore are not necessarily going to raise that issue as something that they're trying to mobilize their voting base. But for Democrats, it's an issue that does move them away. And so on the flip side, I would argue that Democrats are probably scared to bring up this issue, even though it is clearly something of concern to their voting base.
Thank you. I'm going to start a little bit of a lightning round here. And what I mean by that is I'm going to ask questions and try to get all four of you to give 2-minute answers or maybe less so that we can try to move more of the questions through. And also it might be fun, so we'll see how it goes. We're going to start with the issue agenda. If the four of you suddenly found yourself in the position to be the questioner at a presidential debate or a vice presidential debate, what 3 issues would you most want to see be the centerpiece of our debate for the next 40 days? What are the 3 issues you want to see discussed more and in depth? Wendy.
You always go me to first with the ones that, how does that work? No, I'm good. I think one obviously is healthcare, and that is around COVID as well. I mean, it kind of encompasses all of that. But I think COVID has demonstrated the challenges with healthcare being available for all. I think the other would be housing/homelessness, because that's part of what I'm engaged in here in Los Angeles, and what they're going to be able to do to increase the amount of affordable housing, because it has been non-existent in the last four years. And then the last one would be education, which is the great equalizer in many ways across this country. And it's not depending upon where you live, not only in your states, but where you're even in your zip codes. I always talked about that in Los Angeles when I was running for office. It should not matter what your zip code is for the kind of education you're going to receive. So those would be 3 things that I think are really important.
That's great. Lynn Maverick, you're next.
Okay, sorry, I wasn't on the unmute button fast enough there. Okay, I think that I will agree with Wendy on thing number 1, but I would actually want it to be even more specific, which is I want to hear about a COVID nationwide testing plan. How, the vaccine is like one thing, and then it's going to happen or it's not, but we've got to have a plan to be able to move from where we are to the next step. So what's the nationwide testing plan? How is that going to work? The second thing would be, I have this like crazy dream that somebody will start talking about, again, like a big plan, a sort of a national new deal on rebuilding post-COVID. And so how do we rebuild? How do we come back? Technology and jobs, the digital divide, infrastructure, roads, jobs, what kind of jobs for the middle class and for working class. And then in there, I also want like gun background checks, like sort of a new deal for the 21st century. And then the last thing is, I think it's like astonishing how little has been said about immigration. I want security for the dreamers. I want to know what is happening. This is, every American agrees on this. Not every, but a lot of people. We have massive imbalance in public opinion on this. People want this to happen. Neither candidate is talking about it. And I think that's pathetic. So I want to hear about that.
Laurie Frazier.
Actually going to do a time save and say that I agree wholeheartedly with Wendy and Lynn.
Oh, okay. Natalie.
I think I agree with all of those that are said. I mean, I think the one that I would add, which is economic inequality. I mean, this is of course related to COVID, but the differential impacts and what we're going to do for these particularly hard hit communities. And my hope is that, we still push the conversation about racial justice. Yes, it will turn off some voters, but this is deeply impacting lives across our country, and we need to talk about the hard issues.
Okay, I'm going to turn to a different topic, but I did warn you, which was bench building. So if we wanted to convince women from both parties and of all racial and ethnic backgrounds to seek office at rates higher than they do today, what message would you bring? What changes are needed? What do the party establishments have to do to just bring more women into public life? And I'll start again with Wendy because she accuses me of going to her every time.
There you go. Just keep going with that. So I think I will talk in a little bit more on the first on some of the, because the Democratic groups, there's a lot of them out there. So it is Emerge and the Heights, all of a sudden I'm drawing the blank of the first part of that, to Emily's List, to Run, I think a Run with Her. There's a number of organizations that are doing that. And post the election in 2016, in fact, there were thousands of women who signed up on Emily's List, went onto their website and saw over 50,000 women have said, I'm interested in running for office. And I think that the messages that should be going out to and women who are thinking about it is, one, your voice is needed. Two, we will support you. Because that is always a fear factor, which is the guys always have the support, and where's the support for the women? I think each of the parties is realizing the numbers and looking again at gender and how people are voting, and realizing they have to look at how to support those women. And so they're looking at not only though just the high levels. So for example, some of these groups just used to focus on congressional or statewide positions. They are now supporting women just coming into school boards and looking at state legislators, because state legislators are then the bench going up to the statewide positions, to then of course running for Congress, and to be able to train and support them and to be ready for it. And I think that is a wonderful part of what's been happening, is that everyone has realized we need to support these women, and that the issues that matter to them are important to all constituencies out there. And then I think the last thing is understanding that it is okay no matter what age, ethnicity, sexual orientation you have, or if you have a family. I mean, think of how many women now are running that have families, where before, most of the women who ran for office did after they had their children. Even look at Nancy Pelosi, who was later in her life that she ran for office. And today, we are more, I think, effective because we are experiencing that. So you're seeing more women in Congress, the first senator to have a child while in office. The first woman, this is a test for some that, that around Yvonne Brathwaite Burke was the first woman to have a child while in office in Congress decades ago. And so I think changing some of those perceptions of that women actually can in elective office do that. And sorry, that is my dog behind me barking. I'm going to end on that.
Lynn, how do we produce more women candidates?
So yeah, I think that's the right question, because the research in political science demonstrates that when women run, they win at the same rate that men win. So it isn't that they're running and losing, it's that they're not running. And I think, and this is probably the same for all of you, that when I do these big undergraduate classes, Maverick, like, I want to run for Congress, or I'm going to be in the Senate, they're always men. They're always men. And so I wonder if we can't, at the post high school education level, and even in high school, if we can't start planting the seed for women that, this is a pathway that you could take. And I think it helps that more and more women are doing it, young women, and that young women people in their 20s can see that. But I wonder if we as college educators don't also have a role to play there.
Laurie.
So I've mentioned Higher Heights, for example, which is it's a 501c3, but it has a long historical track record of really building and helping women create an infrastructure to run for office. And you need training, you need leadership training, but you also need an infrastructure, folks around you to help you build the war chest. You're not going to win anything with no money, right? You're not going to win anything with very little name recognition and persistent lack of name recognition. So starting with civic organizations like Higher Heights or She Should Run, these kinds of organizations give you on the ground tools to help you build, right? In addition to gaining tools and resources, being networked, you have to be networked with folks who have money, right? In order to be successful over time. Another thing that I want to note is after you gain an infrastructure, you build your network, you expand your war chest, then you also have to be tapped to excel. So if you're stagnant as school board president, right? And no one is encouraging you and lifting you up and giving you opportunities to expand and to grow as a leader, that is a problem, particularly for women of color, to have the opportunity to be in those spaces and in those networks where folks are seeing their leadership and giving them the opportunity to grow and to be tapped and encouraged to run for higher office.
And Natalie.
These are all great points. I mean, I think, I have an extension on to Lynn's comment about, working with our students. I think the biggest difference that I've always seen is that, young men do come and say that they want to run for office and be a leader. Women come up to me and tell me that they want to help their community. Right. And so it's a very different way in which I think men and women are thinking about participating and contributing to their neighborhoods and their communities. And for us to show women, right, that helping their community is leadership. Right. And so in some ways, this is also a narrative change for us as a society to see that what we're doing, women, in which when we're dedicating our time to the community, trying to develop things, build each other, build institutions, that this is leadership, and this is a pathway, right, to running for elective office.
So you won't be surprised to know that we're inundated with questions. So I'm going to start asking some of the backlog of questions that we have. And if you're willing to answer it, just sort of wave at me or just talk.
Can I wait for a second, Gary?
Sure.
Can I one thing? Just sorry, I apologize to Laurie's comment in that being asked to run. A lot of times women believe they have to be asked to run to be supported, where the guys are like, I'm running, who cares? Or I just lost that last race. I'm going to dust myself off and I'm going to run again. And women are less likely to do that after they have lost a race. And the training that is so important in all the organizations is critical, because we also need more women who are running campaigns. Men, most of the time, if you look nationally, it's the guys who are running the campaigns, not the women, and that even happens here locally. And how do we encourage more women to do that? Emily's list, people go, who's Emily? And I said, it's an acronym. Emily stands for Early Money is Like Yeast, which means it rises. And so in that way, educating and helping those women to do it, but the training is so critical. I just wanted to add to that. Sorry to interrupt you.
Totally fine. So I have a specific question for Lynn, which you answered in the chat, but the audience can't see it, which is one audience member wanted to know the approximate volume of the shift post RNC, DNC.
So all of these shifts, okay, let me say this first. I'm going to tell you what the numbers are, and you're going to say like, oh, that's not very big. But I want you to keep in mind that these trends are flat. They're like so flat from July of 2019. So these movements are significant movements. They're less than 10 points, but somewhere in the range of 6 to 8 to 10 points for those various moves. But they're all those high single digits.
Okay, this question's open to anyone. Why have we heard nothing about climate in the campaign? Particularly given its importance to younger voters, who we know are far more likely to identify themselves as concerned about climate change or as an environmentalist. Anybody want to venture a response?
I'll just jump in there just to say, Gary, that we've been asking people to reveal to us the issues that are important to them by making them choose what kind of world they want to live in. And the environment is in there in a number of different ways, among 32 different things that can construct your world. And again, like everyone wants clean air, everyone wants clean water, but man, it is just not a priority for people. There are things that they care about a lot more. And so why don't politicians talk about it? Because it'd be a heavy lift to make that the most important thing for voters. It's at the bottom.
Thank you. Another questioner asks, if the president's been talking about nominating a woman to take Ruth Bader Ginsburg's place, will that be a win for him? Will that have any effect? Anybody want to respond to the Supreme Court nominee?
I will just say, I think it is, since there's so few women in him, he's had a bench of women that he has been able to put up there. I think it really is going to be more focused on her positions on some of the issues that are critical. So whether it is immigration or abortion, women's rights, equal pay, those things are going to be critical. I heard Claire McCaskill, who was the senator from Missouri before recently, and they asked her, is this a plus or a minus for Trump during this? Or for the Republicans actually who are running for other seats in the country? And she said, it's a negative because the focus and attention is going to be on Trump and McConnell and of course the Supreme Court versus the issues that they want to hear in their own states. And it is going to take up a lot of airtime. So they're not excited about this. They're probably excited that they potentially can have a new Supreme Court nominee. But for those that are running in various states, this is not necessarily the most important issue for them. And so it's going to be challenging.
Natalie.
Yeah, and just to add, I think, a lot of the literature does show that voters don't cross parties, putting, for example, a woman candidate on the ballot. And so for this might mobilize strong Trump supporters who feel that he's addressing things that matter for Trump female supporters, but this is not necessarily going to be something that really shifts a large swath of voters to shift in a different way than they would have voted otherwise.
Thank you. I have an answer, by the way, to the immigration question, which is why we haven't heard about immigration. And that is that after 2017 and 2018, I think Trump finally figured out that telling everyone that MS-13 had moved in next door wasn't really working for him. And so it's been a net negative for the Republicans. And then the Democrats are historically afraid of their own shadow on the issue of immigration. So unless it comes up, DACA will come up. I have to think it'll come up in the month of October. But and you're right, there is consensus on this, but I don't think it's likely to be the president's calling card. Couple of other questions. One was, if we had more women in the Senate, would we have different outcomes on things like the HEROES Act or some of the other legislation that's been bottled up? Anybody want to venture on?
I will just say yes, and answer that. We would, because again, women are usually more consensus builders, which is sometimes a negative. I will say personally in a campaign, it was like, oh, you're not going to fight enough versus building consensus to get something done. And you've seen time and time again when there has been a point, I think it was a few years ago, where the women senators made sure that we didn't, run out of money for Congress. Those were the ones that went and worked both sides of the aisle to do that. And I think women have a tendency to be able to bring those kinds of coalitions together.
The flip side of that, Gary, though, the flip side is, I'll just say that there's so much partisan voting in Congress. It's very rare for people to cross their party line on important legislation. So, The
demise of earmarks.
Yeah.
Okay. Several other questions waiting out there for us to address them. I'm sorry, I'm so overwhelmed with them. One is, the president himself has said if he's elected to a second term, he wants to change Medicare and Social Security. Running on Medicare and Social Security was a 60-year strategy for the Democrats. Why are they not mentioning it now when they have videotape of the president actually saying he wants to cut those things? Anybody want to respond to Medicare and Social Security?
I just like, Trump is always running in a Republican primary. Like, he's just always talking to the same set of people. And, maybe the Democrats are just onto that and realize that this is just a silo. I don't know.
Yeah.
We're in COVID and post George Floyd, and there's so many things that are in the everyday in our face that it's hard so much to talk about. I think they're known for being supportive of that for the 60 years, so they're just gonna people know we're gonna be supportive of Medicare and Social Security.
Thank you. Laurie, we have a specific question about the percentages of African-American males who indicate a willingness to support the president, that there is a non-zero gender gap among African-Americans, and we wonder if you have an insight into that particular element.
I think that many scholars who study Black politics have been looking at this, and that we're looking at the extent to which Black men, I think it was somewhere around 6 to 8% in 2016. And so again, we are definitely paying attention to the extent to which Black men will, that overwhelmingly Blacks vote Democrat in presidential elections, 93, 94%. But there is that percentage, and it's by and large Black men. And so we're looking at issues related to how they view Kamala Harris. We're looking at and the role that sexism or other kinds of factors might play a role there. We are looking at the support for Trump on policy issues that matter to Black men, or that they believe matter to the Black community. And we're looking at the role of factors like immigration and healthcare and other things for Black people, particularly Black men. And I say that because by and large, as Lynn noted, there is very high support among all groups for immigration, particularly immigration reform, DACA and other factors, particularly among African Americans. And so, but for the Trump administration, they've done a lot of work bringing out African American men and their families when it comes to issues of immigration and driving a wedge. Immigration has long been a wedge issue, and I think that the Trump administration has used that wedge issue with regards to immigration in terms of work and the impact that immigrants have on low-wage jobs. And so I think it would be helpful if we heard more from the Democratic Party about how they will counter some of those narratives that have long been a part of the GOP as it relates to immigrants and immigration, and to better understand the extent to which Black men are listening and can be moved in any way. But again, it was about 6 to 8%, I believe, in 2016. And it is something that people are watching and paying attention to and trying to better understand. African Americans are not a monolith. Gary, if I could have 20 seconds just to note that on a variety of social issues, African Americans are highly conservative on a variety of issues, fiscally very liberal, but also it's important to know in this context of the post-19, we're like 55th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. So, you know, we have a lot of, you know, a history behind us on the ability to better understand the Black electorate, the things that push us and propel us to go to the polls. But vote choice is not the same thing as voter turnout. And as we found in 2016, whether you're talking about Black women or Black men, just because we are overwhelmingly Democrat in our party preferences does not mean if we're not mobilized consistently across the different strata, 18 to 35, 55 and up, if we're not mobilized in particular ways to get out to the polls, then there will be some complacency or just staying at home. Also, not all Black people support Biden-Harris, right? But many, particularly Black women, as we saw in 2016, the levels of favorability for Hillary Clinton did match that for the levels of favorability for Hillary Clinton was lower than the actual turnout for Black women. But Black women held their nose and voted for Hillary Clinton anyway, right? Because they were motivated, highly motivated to do so. So when you talk about African-American men, what factors are motivating Black men who would defect and would go to the Republican Party in 2020 that would propel them not just to vote for the Democratic candidate, but actually come out and cast a ballot or do a mail-in ballot?
Thank you. That's clarifying. We're going to have a lot of discussion this year about the process of voting. And we have two questions which are sort of related. One has to do with the degree to which early voting, absentee voting, mail-in voting will render the campaign moot for many voters, even in the middle of some of the debates, since people will have already voted. And then the second question around the structure is, will vote suppression change the outcome? Is the mechanisms of voting likely to affect the election in meaningful ways? And so wave at me if you want to speak to either of those. I know Lynn Maverick does. Okay, Lynn.
I'll just take the first part. And, you know, as someone who studies campaigns and the effects they have on voters, it's always worried me that, you know, there might be 4 weeks left in the campaign and people have voted. I think that's worried me less and less over the years as more and more people are, you know, think that their party identification is determining their vote. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think that people are members of parties because they like the policy packages those parties provide, and they have social identities that are tied up in those parties, and they have emotion about it. I think it's all fine. So you know, you're a Republican, you vote for the Republican, same for the Democrat. And then, you know, people who are undecided are probably not sending their ballots in right away. They're probably holding on. So I think that this is not something to worry about. And particularly in this year, when you think, do I want to send my ballot in early or do I want to hold it until the very end? I'd say if you're inclined, you're leaning one way pretty surely, sending your ballot in early in 2020 is probably more important than holding it until the very last word has been spoken in the campaign. In this year, that might not be the same in all years, but I worry about this a lot less than I used to.
Anybody else want to?
I would just add to that, I think that particularly we're lucky in the state of California because we have early voting, we have a lot of different things. You also, and I encourage everyone to go on Secretary of State's website, because if you've mailed your absentee ballot and you're worried did it get there, you can actually track it when it's received. And that's a really important part, I think, that we don't have in other states. I am worried in other states where people were used to mailing theirs on a Saturday and it would get to their place on Monday and they would be counted. And so I think everyone is spending a lot of effort and time to reach out to make sure that people get their ballots in, and you will see both parties calling, and even some going door to door and saying, did you, we see that you have not submitted your actual ballot yet and you are mail-in, you need to do it. How do we help you get it there? There's going to be a huge focus of getting in those ballots early.
And Gary, I just want to jump in here. I am very concerned about the mode of voting in the African-American community. Mail-in ballot is not something that is commonly used. Than the symbolic, historic nature of standing on the line. Michelle Obama has told us to pack a lunch and bring our yard chair and get ready. But I worry about our elders, those who are high risk, those who don't trust the post office, who have a mistrust of the mail-in system, and they historically have counted on and looked forward to the symbolic nature of casting that ballot on election day and trusting that particular process. And so I do worry about the precautions that are being put in place on the ground to provide safety and safety measures for, and what can we do? Again, I will offer some things that can be can be mailed out, sent out later, but ways in which, even folks who don't do this for a living can think about helping their community. We used to have Souls to the Polls, but many of the churches have not reopened, and they will not reopen in the next 39 days. So I remain very, it gives me great pause for the African-American community if we are not doing what we need to do on the ground to adjust, particularly given the historic nature of this campaign and this election, but also for African-American voters. The mode of voting in terms of mailing in their ballot isn't something that is traditional, and the lack of trust that's going on in the African-American community should all make us sit up and figure out how we can work harder in the next 39 days.
I mean, I think, we really do, voter suppression is a real concern. And in the name of trying to ensure safety under COVID, to do things like mail-in voting, this is still a point in which there could be acts of or efforts of suppression happening. I mean, I think the other thing to take in mind is when we change voting procedures, this change oftentimes causes more problems in terms of turnout for marginalized and immigrant communities of color, right? Who already we spend a lot of time educating about voting, about registration, about going to the polls, and then changing the procedure in many ways, kind of midway through this election cycle is something that we were very concerned specifically, for African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, that we already see many challenges for turnout. I mean, what we saw in LA County is that when we shifted over to the mail-in ballots in the vote centers, is that there's evidence to suggest that turnout was down specifically in areas of South LA, East LA, in areas with high shares of Black and Latino voters. And that was with a lot of money invested in LA to ensure that people were informed, that the procedures were working fairly. But clearly there was a lot of inequity in what happened, right? And that was something that was planned out. That was, coronavirus here now is something that the entire country is ill prepared for in terms of our preparation for a lot of things, but casting a ballot is one of those here that we were really not prepared to do. And so thinking about voting equity and voting and making sure folks can properly submit their ballot is something that we really need to pay close attention to.
So our time is up. I'm going to give each of the four of you 15 seconds. 15 seconds to answer the following question, and then we're going to turn it back over to our chair. The 15-second question is this, and I'll start with you, Natalie, and I'll work backwards. Wendy, you'll be last. There are over 200,000 dead Americans and 14 million people unemployed. Why on earth is this even close? Natalie.
Unfortunately, in our country today, partisanship seems to be the carry-all for how we vote, and we vote by party, which means that we are ignoring some counter arguments to why you should change your vote.
Laurie.
And I'll close the same way that I opened, with the stability of party ID and the role of partisanship, and those divisions have only widened. Right. And so again, I'll stick to the plan, Gary, with 15 seconds, but I'm concerned about the deepening divide in our partisanship here in the US.
Lynn.
A layer on top of that, it didn't have to be this way. The virus got politicized about 3 or 4 weeks in, when the president started saying things like, those blue state governors don't want you to go to church, they don't want you to go to work, they don't. And so that's when you started to see the partisanship divide in the electorate start to happen. In the beginning, everybody was on the same page. And so it got politicized by elites, which does give me hope that elites can depoliticize it, and maybe we'll get to see that happen.
Wendy.
So I agree, partisanship, but I think the one word is fear. So that people are either fearful that they're not going to have their job and they want to have a change, or they're fearful of someone who is going to allow people to take over their cities, whatever it is, the kind of a tweet of the day. And so fear has a big, I think, a focus on this. And then I just want to, lastly, I love UCLA. This is why I'm so happy I went there. All of these women and you, Gary, and the foundation. I mean, this is amazing. I'm so proud to be a Bruin.
Did you guys know that's what we do now that we can't do the 8 clap? We do 4, yeah, that's what we do because we can't do the 8 clap.
Thank you all for your very great answers, and I'm going to turn it back over to my friend Susan.
A heartfelt thank you to my Luskin School colleagues, Dean Gary Segura and Wendy Gruel, and Professors Laurie Frazier, Natalie Masauka, and Lynn Maverick. The information and experiences you've provided have enhanced our own knowledge. That and your time are much appreciated. Thank you as well to UCLA Women in Philanthropy members and other supporters for participating in our webinar. We will be sending you a link to a recording of the panel discussion and contacts of the panelists. In addition, you'll be able to find a link to the recording on our website. Also, a tremendous thank you to Women in Philanthropy staff, Melissa Efron-Hayek, and the development events team of Melissa Delgadillo, Stella Plato, and Eduardo Ponte for helping with all of the Zoom meeting logistics. We'll be hosting additional webinars throughout the fall, so look for invitations to other interesting programs from Women in Philanthropy. Thanks again. Good afternoon.